This is Paul Morrissey, 2005, Blood for Dracula screen test. I made this test, like the Frankenstein test, the same day at Cinecittà, just to use the film and use the camera, which was a Taddeo lens. Surgeon Zelenovic was my first choice to play Count Dracula for many reasons. He reminded me a great deal of somebody who belonged in a vampire movie. He was from Yugoslavia, but he was Serbian. He had an extraordinarily deep voice, like his voice was coming from the grave. He had a very great height. He had an inner reserve and an aristocratic bearing that was very unusual. And he was reserved and aloof and uncommunicative. And when he spoke, you paid more attention to a person like that. And I really wanted to make a Dracula film that was different than the Frankenstein that I was about to make, because I knew Frankenstein would be very absurdist, really. And I thought, well, I'll switch and I'll make Dracula not absurd, but only slightly absurd, and the character will be much more, isolated by his accent, by his aloofness, by his height, by his different bearing. He was not of a modern era, coming from growing up in a Soviet slave camp like Yugoslavia. He was very different. His father was a general in Tito's army, and his brother a famous basketball player, and was also very tall. But the story behind his being unable to be used in Dracula is a funny story nowadays, but at the time it wasn't. For him, as the Frankenstein movie was being made, he was staying in a pension, and halfway through the Frankenstein film, the producer, Carlo Ponti's representative, told me there was a problem. The police had come to his pension looking for him. In those days, you couldn't go into a hotel or pension without putting your passport at the desk, which was then put into the police department's registry. They saw his passport was the same as someone who had been arrested 2 years before and deported for some sort of infraction of the law. And rather than put people in prisons in Italy, they deported them, and if they come back then, they put them in prison. And unfortunately, it was his passport had been stolen. The person had used his passport when they were arrested, and it was impossible to clear the matter up in the next week or so before the film started. The producer told me he had produced 100 films at least, and he had never produced a film in which the police were looking for the leading actor, and asked me if I'd reconsider casting, which I hesitated to the last day or so, and decided it was too much responsibility to put on the poor producer. And I used Udo, who had been Baron Frankenstein, to play Count Dracula, and it turned out extremely well. The film is still serious compared to Frankenstein, but it is a little funnier than it might have been with The Surgeon.